all those who've been away, especially Josh and Liz, Mazel Tov again. Birth of another Heineken.
Should we close the door?
Why not?
Here in Toronto or?
Says Chamashal to Avi. Avi is going to the land of the warm Jews, to Florida.
The land of our grandfathers.
Warm Okay. Parashat Vayera, we will. So we'll start. We'll start with page 318. In this week's portion, the Almighty is informing Moshe that a redemption is going to occur. This is a redemption that will come with a great show with many plagues. Seven of them mentioned in this week's portion. The first part of this week's portion actually has in verse 6 where Moshe is told, Lachen emor livnei Yisrael, so page 318, verse 6, tell the people of Israel that Ani Hashem, I am God, Hotzei eschem mitachas sivlos Mitzrayim, I'm going to go ahead and take you out of the oppression, the burdens of Egypt. Number 2, Hitzalti etchem, I'm going to rescue you. Number 3, Ga'alti etchem, I shall redeem you. Number 4, I shall lakachti, I will take you as a nation. And then, in verse 8, we are told, Veheveti etchem, that I shall bring you. Now, 5 different actions are mentioned here. 4 of them merit a cup on the Seder. The 5th one is cupless because we only have 4 cups. But nevertheless, we have a kos shel Eliyahu, a person who's been linked based on tradition to the future redemption, and therefore he could be linked to the 5th language that describes the progression of the people of Israel, where we will arrive in the land of Israel, indicating that we are still in the journey. We have not reached number 5 yet. We are waiting for the messianic figure. That's what's mentioned. I would like to focus specifically on the second plague. So turn to page 328. Okay. So we're familiar with plague number 1, which was the blood. It's a logical plague because it's a society that worshipped the Nile. They worship the Nile. The Almighty starts off the process of education, because we can actually analyze the 10 plagues as 10 statements, 10 teachings, 10 lessons. And the lesson number 1 was that you Egyptians, and thus you Jews, who thought the Nile gives you life, well, the Nile doesn't give you life, it gives you death, because when you worship such forces, pagan practice and idolatry destroys you. Number two, plague number 2 is going to be described on page 328 in verse 26, where he tells him that you should know, if you don't send them, verse 27, I'm going to go ahead and plague your entire boundaries with frogs. Now we translate it as frogs because Rashi and many commentators say that Sfardeim are frogs. It works well with us because we are familiar with modern Hebrew. Modern Hebrew turned to the Bible to recreate the language, and therefore it placed frogs as Sfardeim. So in modern Hebrew, frogs are Sfardeim. However, there are commentators who date back to the early 11th century and later, among them Rabbeinu Hananel and Sforno, that actually view the Tzfardeim as crocodiles. Crocodiles. So you have to, as you are imagining the events that occur with frogs, you're going to have to upgrade it a little bit mentally into crocodiles. And actually, when we are told at the end that they shall only remain in the Nile, it works well with crocodiles. Now, I haven't been in Egypt. I'm sure someone in our shul has been in Egypt, right? Not possible otherwise. No? I have a hard time believing that.
But in
Our
Africa,
ancestors.
Yes.
Oh, well, yeah,
What about massaging?
Musashi, okay, they lived in Egypt, so we have to ask them.
He was born in Egypt.
He was born in Egypt. Okay, so we have to ask him, are there frogs in the Nile? We call Mubarak, is sitting in a jail facing the Nile, and we could ask him, crocodiles we know of, what's the frog situation in the Nile? Because if the text tells us that they remain there, there's no reason to believe that global warming has changed that. Two approaches to it. Just be mindful of it. Maybe you could share it at the Seder. Fine. So we are told in verse 28, V'sharat sayar tzfardeim.
Why did the Chazal say well, there were crocodiles versus frogs? Or maybe they didn't say.
So number one, you have to realize
Because it also says that they were in the ovens. They were everywhere, and I can't picture crocodiles coming out
Okay,
of the
so
ovens.
I'm going to tell you that we're talking about baby crocodiles. They start off small, right? So the small ones are going to make it into the oven, right? I mean, you experienced snakes in a bedroom in Atlanta, right? So you can imagine these things. What?
We did.
You did, yes. A terrifying story, which I
But
don't...
I picked it up by its tail and it became a staff.
Stop. Worked. You're the leader.
Maybe these could have been dinosaurs?
Maybe dinosaurs, you said.
Maybe dinosaurs.
But the fact is that we are told by Yaor that they remain in the Nile.
Yeah. Maybe there are dinosaurs and
I think I would have heard of it.
like
in
the
other
Loch
words,
Ness monster,
some the Lech Nos or something. Whatever. it was.
Loch Ness.
Loch Ness.
Yeah,
But
maybe.
there are crocodiles in Africa. Egypt is in
Crocodiles in Africa. So it makes sense.
today.
Fine. Whatever it is, where do they land up? Verse 28, they are going to be in your rooms, where you sleep, on your beds, in the houses of your servants, and in your ovens. And the last one is the misharotecha, kneading bowls. Why are kneading bowls called misharotecha? Remember this?
Yeah, long time ago he said that.
Yeah, no.
The leftover. I don't know. You better explain it. I don't know what that
It's already something. So,
No sir.
very good.
Yeah.
Shh, you see, Avi knows. In Hebrew, or in the Torah language, there is two words appear that describe leftovers. One of them is notar, things that are left over, and one is nishar. The difference between the two is that when you have undesirable leftovers, they're notar. Things that you have a plate, you're supposed to finish dinner, you don't finish it, right? You try to run to the garbage can without the spouse or the parent noticing. Those things are notar. Nishar is when you leave things over with an intention, that you have a desire to have things left over. Okay? That's the difference between the two. The way they made sourdough, exactly. The way they made dough is by having sourdough which was left over from an earlier batch. The leftover dough was not notar, it was not something that was undesirable, it was desirable. You wanted the sourdough, so therefore it was called nishar or seor with an aleph. Seor. Seor is sourdough. And it is a leavening agent. And therefore when it comes to the nullification of chametz, you say that I am nullifying all chametz and all seor. And the Torah uses the word seor. So that's the sourdough that was left over with intention. And throughout Torah you will sense, you will pick up that there is a reason that the Torah uses the specific word. The kneading bowls, where were the objects where they would leave the or where they would leave the leftover of a batch to create sourdough, and therefore they are called the misharot. It is a bowl that holds the nishar, the left over that is desirable. That's what's mentioned here. Fine, that's not our main discussion here. The frogs attack everywhere. In verse 3, the necromancers try to imitate it as well. In verse 4, Vayikra Paro Moshe, and he says to him, Ha'atiru el Hashem, turn to God, he shall remove these frogs from me, and I'll let you go. It didn't work, but nevertheless Moshe prays to the Almighty. We are described, a few more details are given regarding the frogs. I would like to focus specifically on the Midrash. Now, the study of Talmud is really the foundation of the way the Jew thinks. We get our legal information from it. We get philosophical information from it. Historical information as well. It was not the goal of the authors, but there's history there as well. And there is what we would call machshava, the way of thinking, Jewish thought. In the area of Jewish thought, you turn in the Talmud often to what is known as the Haggadot. Haggadot, the stories. The Talmud shares with us many, many stories. Some of the stories are ones that are occurring in Babylonia as they are editing the work. So you could rely on many of them, not all, many of them as ones that are describing historical facts that occurred. But there are times that the rabbis in the Talmud are going to be sharing with us details about what occurred in the wilderness, or in the days of Avraham, or in the days of Noah. Information that is not in the text of the Torah, but rather information that they are presenting as some kind of tradition. So the question is, how do we deal with Haggadot? How do we deal with these stories? Are they reliable? Are they there for a reason? These are questions that are asked. And the reason that we ask these questions on Haggadot is because often in the Talmud and Midrashim, which compile many of such stories, we have descriptions that are supernatural. For example, that when Yehuda approaches Yosef in Egypt and begins the process of threatening him that he better release their brother Binyamin, that he starts throwing pillars into the air and knocking them with his fist and causing the pillars to be pulverized, meaning ones that are not really natural. And you ask yourself, did the rabbis actually have a tradition that this occurred? Are the rabbis trying to share with us some kind of message? What are we supposed to do with it? And people have struggled with the concept of Haggadot for many, many, many centuries. Fine? Now, come the 10th century, there is a new bird in the Jewish world, and that is a Jewish traditional philosopher. We have philosophers. Okay, the first one, even though Rambam is accredited as the greatest, we have Rav Sadia Gaon. And Rav Sadia Gaon is a philosopher, and he coins a term which is extremely significant for the development of Jewish thought. And that is that, for example, when it comes to mitzvot, there are two types of mitzvot. We just discussed it. The ones that are rational and the ones that we only do them because we experienced the revelation at Mount Sinai. Right? Sichliot, things that are seichelic, things that are logical, and shma'iyot, things that I perform because I heard them at Har Sinai. Fine. Now, why is that an introduction to Judaism? Because by telling people that you should know, there are things that you could rationalize. So you are telling a religious group, you are turning to a religious group. Religion in general is based on the fact that humans cannot understand everything, and they are relying to determine wrong and right by hearing some kind of voice from above. That's the foundation of religion. So if I'm relying on, if the essence of religion is that I am relying on some greater being to guide me, so therefore, basically, religion on the surface is supposed to be that when you walk into a study hall, you take your thinking brain, right, and you leave it at the door. Because how can I be processing logical, not logical, if I am being guided here by a being who is so much greater than logic? In other words, I should be thinking when I'm practicing my religion. That would be the normal approach, and that exists within the realm of religion, right? In other words, if you study, if you look what's happening in the world a little bit, and you look at elements of what's happening in Islam, right? It is basically, you set aside anything that is rational, because God told me that if someone shames the prophet, right, you go ahead and you shoot him up. God told me that they are infidels, right? So therefore, so what if I would think through it, I would see it otherwise. My thinking is insignificant, right? I'm no different than an ant, right? My brain is worthless because I'm being guided by the Word of God. So we have an introduction to Judaism that says, you know what? You could actually think. You could rationalize things. Okay? Mazel tov. So that's a big introduction. So comes Rambam. And Rambam takes it one step further. Rambam tells you, listen, if thinking is permissible, it's not just permissible, it is actually a must to be a good Torah Jew. Because if you know that there are rational mitzvot, and you know that you have a rational mind, so go ahead and sharpen that rational mind. And therefore, study philosophy. Because what is philosophy? It is a system to develop a way of thinking. And that is the will of God as well, because He wants you to understand. He wants you to go ahead and understand the world. So, that is the great philosopher of Rambam. So now, with this development, right, with this new approach that things have to be rational, so if I would be a being, if I would take a primitive approach to religion, and I study in the Talmud something that's irrational, for example, we are told that the nation of Israel are in the wilderness. In the last year, as they are settled there on the east bank of the Jordan River, they are attacked. They are attacked by someone called Og, the king of Bashan. He's a giant. He's a giant, we are told. Well, the text itself does indicate that he was big, but here we are told that he is a giant. And what he does is that he wants to destroy the people of Israel, so he uproots a mountain. He uproots a mountain. This is in the Talmud. And he is ready to throw the mountain on the people of Israel and kill them all. But luckily some ants came and ate through the mountain, and it fell over his head. And it gives us a description of how he was knocked out by Moshe with some kind of tremendous act, even though when Moshe jumped, he only reached his ankle, right? That's what we are told. So this is a description of a story. If my approach to religion and religion text is that it happened, I have to be a Torah Jew and just accept it. If, on the other hand, I take a rational, then I struggle with it much more. I don't want to laugh at it because this isn't Talmudic literature. There must be a message there. I can't go ahead and accept it because it's not rational. What do I do? What do I do? So this is something that we struggle often with, Haggadot. And we take guidance from the Rambam, who tells us that believe that there are messages there. Other rabbis had a reason to share it in a specific way. Sometimes you try to understand them, sometimes not. This is what the Rambam tells us. As you know very well, that in the Rambam's lifetime, and after his passing, there was a big pushback against him and his approach. Right? Like someone once wrote a letter, one of his disciples writes to Rambam that people are criticizing you, and they're saying not nice things about you. So the Rambam responded, listen, it doesn't bother me one iota. I'm just here for the truth. And if the person saying not nice things about me enjoys it, so there's a rule that if one party benefits and the other one doesn't mind, you go with the one that benefits. So he writes, listen, the guy writing and saying not nice things about me seems to enjoy it. I don't care, so let him do it. It doesn't affect me one iota. The Rambam is above it all. After the Rambam's passing, what happens is that there's a strong movement to even ban his works, never will work. And they even burnt his works in France in the year 1242. They burnt his works. Eventually, they regretted it. So now there's a big push among rabbinic authorities. How do you deal with it? Because, for example, there are those who want to study medicine, but when you would walk out with some book, a medical book, in the 13th century, they would start screaming at you. You're studying something for it? Are you a follower of Rambam? Right? It was the Jewish world was a little bit crazy, so they needed guidance how to deal with it. So they turned to a great rabbinic authority. His name was Rabbi Shlomo ben Aderet. And Rabbi Shlomo ben Aderet said, "Listen here, let's try to work these things out. Perhaps we shouldn't be studying the philosophy of Rambam at this point, but if a person needs to study medicine, that's 100% fine. And when the person's mature, they reach an old age, like 25, then already perhaps they could start studying philosophy." In other words, he was working out these details. He was the leader of that period. Okay, that's what's happening in the Jewish world at that time. So now, this same Rabbi Shlomo ben Aderet, who we view as one of the most traditional thinkers, authors, halakhic authorities, so he decided to write a book on the Haggadot of the Talmud. And what he wants to do is he wants to go ahead and deal with many of these issues. The Jewish world is more rational. The Jewish world needs something to be presented with explanations that make sense. So that's what he tries to achieve. So it is a wonderful work that when you are studying Talmud and you're studying Agadah and you want to find a deeper message there, you'll turn to the works of the Rashba. And now, I'm going to share with you one of his insights that relates to the mountain on Big Og's hands. But he starts off by telling us that you should know that there are many different reasons why there are midrashim and why there are weird Haggadot. And then he tells us that there are times that you had students in class and the rabbis, ha-chachamim dorshim their rabbim, the rabbis were giving a long drasha. Has that ever happened to you? You sit through a long drasha? Okay, Baruch Hashem. Uma'arichim bedivrei to'elet. And he tells us there are times that the rabbinic authorities are teaching valuable things. Did that ever happen? Okay. But vehayu ha'am yeshanim. Now that I can tell you, it doesn't. That I can tell you, I know for a fact. So he notes, and he's telling us here why funny things appear in the Talmud at time. And he says, "V'kidei le'oreram," and at times to awaken the crowd, hayu omrim lahem dvarim zarim. They would say some weird things. Levahalam, to shaken them. What? The rabbi said that, right? V'sheitoreru mishnatam, to wake them up. So there are things that appear in the Talmud that are wake-up calls. Okay. And he shares with us, for example, like a midrash, that the Rebbe was giving a drasha, nitznamnem atzibur. As Rebbe was talking, the olam had given verschloft. So says Rebbe, he looks around and he realizes, I can't just continue here with my information, right? The next thing I know, in those days it was not even a video recorder, that at least he could talk to the video. He's going to be talking to no one. So we are told that Rebbe gets up and he declares, Yalda isha achat b'mitzrayim. Once upon a time, there was a woman in Egypt who gave birth to shishim ribo bekeres achat, who gave birth to 600,000 children at one shot. So the Talmidim wake up and they say, what are you talking about? Right? That's weird, right? Very weird. Natural, right? So I won't doubt that there was one Talmud there who was up. One Talmud who took everything as a given, and if he would have walked out at that moment, he would have been telling everyone that Rebbe said that it's possible to give birth to 600,000 in one shot. Now, after, when the students asked him, he clarified that Yocheved gave birth to Moshe, who is equivalent to all of Klal Yisrael, 600,000. So that's how he explains to us that you should know, don't take everything literal. Think through it, process it. And then he notes, for example, with Og, that Og, this guy Og, according to tradition, lived in the days of Avraham. And he actually did an act of kindness for Avraham Avinu by informing him that his cousin Lot was taken, so he did an act of kindness for Abraham. Now, the Jewish people, their survival, their success, is in the merits of the matriarchs and patriarchs. B'schut avot, b'schut imahot. Correct? So now, when we are in a challenging situation, we pray to God, and these individuals, which are compared to mountains, we find in Midrashim, right? Esa enai el harim, not just harim, but horim, that they are like mountains to protect us. So now, if the patriarch Abraham is a mountain that protects us, so whenever a nation would come and attack Klal Yisrael, we had a mountain that was there, a spiritual mountain, that really took care of our welfare. But Og, the giant Og, he did an act of kindness to Abraham. So he uprooted the mountain, and therefore he technically had the ability to overcome Klal Yisrael. He uprooted the mountain of the Avot. So therefore Moshe was the one, and there he goes on to describe the details. It's a beautiful insight into the Midrash. Extremely important, right, to know that the Midrash has a message, and the rabbis, at times we can find a commentator who will share it with us, other times not. Now, all this is an introduction to a specific Midrash, which I think I've shared with you, and I'll share with you a new way of understanding it. Rashi talks about the frog. What happens in Egypt is that there is a frog attack. But if you look in verse 2 on page 328 in chapter 8, and we are told there that in verse 2, that Aaron stretches out his hand over the waters. And what happens? In verse 2, what comes up to attack? In verse 2, Vata'al, and what arises? You would expect the frogs in the plural. No, one frog. That's it. One frog. What's that all about? So if you read Pshat, you will tell me that, listen, I could point to several areas in Tanakh where when you are addressing a large or many items, you describe it as one. But comes a Midrash that Rabbi Akiva shares with us. And Rabbi Akiva, it's in Rashi here that you should know. Tzfardea achat haita. When the plague began, it was just one big frog, one frog that comes out of the Nile, one crocodile if you want. And then the Egyptians were makinota, the Egyptians were striking it. A big frog, it was an unwanted frog, so the Egyptians decided we have to take care of it. And as they are striking the frog, what's coming out of the mouth of the frog? Many small frogs. And I do remember either coloring books or in Haggadah Shel Pesach or something that was at home at some point where this image was presented of Egyptians with sticks, big frog getting its stripes and the spit out of little frogs. This is what Rabbi Akiva tells us. The rabbi doesn't agree, but this is presented as an explanation. What's the message there? What's the message there? So now, if we are told that there is a deep message to Midrashim, another approach is that perhaps what's taking place with the Midrash is not so much that the rabbis are sharing with you a tradition or what they believe occurred then, but they perhaps are addressing a contemporary event, and they are using or they are describing events of the past to share with you an opinion or an outlook of what's occurring now. Okay, now Rabbi Akiva is the authority who shares with us this wonderful image of the big frog spitting out smaller frogs. What's Rabbi Akiva involved in the year 130 through 135? There's a rebellion, right? There's a rebellion against the Romans. The Romans are brutal. They find a charismatic leader by the name of Bar Kokhba, who leads the rebellion. They have a headquarters in a place called Beitar, and they actually succeed to some extent to throw out the Romans. Eventually, we know that it didn't work out well. But Rabbi Akiva was the official rabbi of the movement. The Rabbi Akiva is the official rabbi of the rebellious movement. And it's interesting to note, I had a great uncle who wrote a book on it, and he noted something very fascinating, that in the Mishnah in Sukkot, it's talking about the 4 species. The 4 species, we have a lulav, we have 3 hadassim, 2 aravot. Rabbi Akiva in the Mishnah says, nope, no need for that. You're supposed to have a lulav, 1 hadas, and 1 arava. That's what Rabbi Akiva says. And on the coins of Bar Kochva, you actually is an image of a lulav with 1 hadas and 1 arava, following Rabbi Akiva. So we have statements where he declares that this is the figure, the star, and therefore it's called Bar Kochva, the one that will be the Messiah. There are many, many statements that Rabbi Akiva is that follower. Now, the problem is, in every rebellion, is that there are very few people who are committed to the cause. Right? In other words, if we would interview, in the beginning of the process of that rebellion, if we would interview the majority of Jews in Eretz Yisrael, they would say, we're not joining a rebellion. Why? We work things out now. I could feed my family. Yes, there are difficulties, and yes, the taxes are very high, and yes, we are limited with practicing some mitzvot, but we figured things out, and we could live with such limited oppression. Then you have a very small core group that believes, listen, we have to gain our freedom. So how does the small core convince the larger group? Right? You study the history of the United States. That they're controlled by the British, by the redcoats, they call them. And the majority, a very small, very large percentage, was not interested in, we could live with the condition as is. But what happens is the way, if you ever want to go ahead and move forward with a rebellion, the plan is as follows. The small group does something harsh to the controlling authority, like dumping tea in the Boston Harbor. Right? You go ahead and you hurt them. Then the controlling authority turns around, and what do? They react with harshness, but not just towards the small rebels or terrorists, but to the larger group. Then the larger group gets agitated, and that's how they're going to fight back, right? It's always a concern if you think even now with in Europe, right? I'm not telling the Europeans what to do, but to take a very strong stand against Muslims in Europe would not be wise. Not going to be wise. What's going to happen is you're going to have more of them turning into extremists. There's no question about that. You have to use wisdom. I don't know if Europeans have that or not, but that's what has to be done. And Rabbi Akiva here is telling the other scholars who don't agree with him. And he says to them, listen, your concern is that, yes, Bar Kochva is charismatic, and yes, we could overthrow the Romans, but we don't have the numbers. We don't have the numbers. Because the fact is that very few of us agree. Well, what's going to happen is that the Romans are going to strike us. The Romans are going to strike us for acts for anything we do. They're going to strike us if we go ahead and cause damage to their railroad or whatever forms of transportation they had then. And by them striking us, we're going to multiply. By them striking us, we're going to multiply. That's what happens. What do you think?
I think it's exactly the opposite. You attack the Romans who are here, they're going to multiply. They're going to send reinforcements. It's the exact opposite.
You have the ability to look at history and know what happened, as that they brought them all the way from England. Actually, they brought the legions from Egypt. But so Rabbi Akiva got it wrong. That's unfortunately what they said. But on the surface, by the way, it did grow immediately. In other words, it did take hold. There are those who believe there's a dispute if they actually conquered Jerusalem or not during the Bar Kochva rebellion. But they were able to overthrow the Romans precisely for that reason. You had a small group. They fought against the Romans. The Romans retaliated by hitting everyone. And as the Romans retaliated, the rebellion grew. Many people joined. You strike the frog, what's going to happen? It's going to be spitting out many other people. So this is an insight my father had, a very South American insight, and I'll tell you why. Because if you learn about South America in '50 and the '60s, and you talk about, the Che Guevara, and you talk about Castro, and this was the attitude. A rebellion, was a very South American way of thinking. But this was his insight into this midrash, which I think is a nice one because it takes something that, again, it perhaps is taught to children. It's debatable if it is wise that the child walks around with an image his whole life of something that's not rational. It's not so clear that that's the right thing, but it's done. But somehow you have an insight, and this is an insight that we are not reading here what Rabbi Akiva really believed to be pshat in the verse, but we are reading here what Rabbi Akiva used, or the way he presented his opinion of current events. Interesting it is. Now I mentioned the fact of Rambam, rational thinking. I'll share with you one other thing about that. We in Judaism have a lot of literature, right? We are indeed people of the book. It's an incredible amount of literature that exists. A lot of the literature we trace back to the Talmudic period, and if I would have shelves at home, I would label some shelves. I mean, I do have shelves at home, but what I mean is that if I organized our shelves at home, I would have it as reliable text, right? And then text that perhaps correct, perhaps not. In other words, you take the Chumash, the information in the Chumash. The Chumash belongs on the reliable shelf, correct? The Tanakh belongs on the reliable shelf. The Mishnah, the Talmud. But then, if I have some thinker, some magnificent thinker from the 20th century, it's Torah, I will pick up the book if it falls, but not everything that is stated there is from Sinai. It could be his own insight, and it could be an insight that's a little bit shvach, is weak. Then there have been books throughout our history that among different schools, you had a different approach to it. For example, the COR asked me to write something for Pesach. They're a little bit. They put out this magazine. They asked me to write about something about Pesach. So there is a book that appeared in the 18th century called Chemdat Yamim, a book, and it mentions practices. It mentions some new practices, and these are practices that were unheard of up until that point. For example, having a Seder on Tu B'Shvat. No one ever had a Seder in Tu B'Shvat throughout our history. This book called Chemdat Yamim comes up with a formula for a Seder on Tu B'Shvat. And actually it gained a level of popularity. You hear about it more now, I'm sure, than you did decades ago. So now, this book, it was questionable who's the author, where does it come from? So Rav Yaakov Emden, who was a big zealot, he was of the opinion that this is a book that originates in the study hall of the followers of Shabtai Tzvi. In other words, he believed that it is very problematic literature. But yet, in this day and age, among Sfardim and among Hasidim, this is a text that's, that's quoted, that they practice it. So I mentioned it in the article. I'm still waiting to see if it's going to be rejected or not, because there's something, to mention. Rabbi Yaakov Emden does say it. I'm not taking a position. I'm not a scholar in that field. But it's always interesting to know when you have questionable works. One of these questionable works, and you could give a whole lecture on it, was a book called Shi'ur Koma. Shi'ur Koma. There is a book. This is a book from maybe the 9th, 10th, 11th century. Okay, I don't think it's earlier, but the Rambam addresses it. And it is a book that talks about the measurements of God. So it's esoteric, some kind of mystical text that talks about the measurement of God. So the Rambam, it became popular. People, up until this day, follow and believe that it's a Kabbalistic text that talks about mystical things. Okay, there are those who believe it. Rambam was asked about it, and he said, absolutely not, it shouldn't be used. I believe that it's one that came from some Edomites We're not sure exactly who he refers to, but he believes that it's a book that should be avoided. There are those who believe that there is a mitzvah to read it every day, because in that same book of Shir Koma, it says that if whoever studies Shir Koma every day has a portion in the world to come. So, being Jewish is a bit complex at times. When you have the Rambam warning us, get that out of your house. And then you have the great Kabbalist, right, this great mystic who's telling you, read it every day, and you will merit a portion in the world to come. Confusing? At times, yes. So what's fascinating to me is the Ramah. The Ramah. Ramosha Isserlis. People have been to his caver. He is one that we as Ashkenazi Jews are extremely comfortable, confident, and proud of the fact that we follow his traditions. And he was asked in a letter what's his view of this Shir Koma concept. Okay? So he doesn't address the book, if it's a valid book or not, but he decides to address the statement that if you study Shir Koma, you merit the world to come. Comes the Ramah and he says that Shir Koma is to understand the world that we live in. Because God really stands in this world. Because there is a natural world that is magnificent, we recognize God, Marabu Masecha Hashem, we recognize God in this world. Correct? So therefore, it really keeps as if God's standing. So the Ramah says that what we are being told with this statement is that if you study science every day, and your study of science is not just, for your own personal curiosity, but for the purpose of seeing the brilliance of the Almighty. That you open a text on biology and you are amazed at what there is in a cell and how it functions, right? And you read about chemical reactions and you are inspired that there's such wisdom of God. If you see God in nature and you study nature to see God, that is a person that merits a portion in the world to come. That's what we are told. And this is from a very rational approach to Judaism. There are this is something that we've discussed often. There are so many different schools that exist. Judaism survives when we realize that everyone is making a contribution. And even those that, will take the most basic approach. Remember when my father came to Toronto, in 1990, he gave a talk. And he gave a talk, and he talked about the Midrash, that the reason Yitzchak was blind when it came to the blessing of Esav, he couldn't see, was because when he was on the altar, his face was facing heaven, and the angels cried. And just as a warning that if there's any tears from angels falling from the sky, it will cause you blindness. That's what we are told, that's how he became blind. So my father came up with an explanation, and he said it straight out, that don't take this literal, but rather it symbolizes the fact that he reached such a high spiritual level, laying there on the altar, that he was no longer able to interact with the physical world and see the flaws of Esav. Because when a person is in a different realm, in a different spiritual realm, evil is no longer understood by him. So that's the idea of the tears of the angels. My father gave that insight. Afterwards, he heard that there were one person, or perhaps more, that were disturbed that he claimed that the Midrash is not literal. I would say, tell you the name of but it's not significant. There's someone that was disturbed by it. So there is a way of thinking of people that take it, and it is all the byproduct of it's religion. The whole idea of religion, there's a God. God could do anything, right? God could make angels cry, right? There's no question about it. So why are we becoming rational? Well, that's an approach of, you know what? You want to think? Leave it outside the Bet Midrash. Rav Sadia, Rambam, and I would say, thank God, the majority of the Jewish world understands today that yes, there's faith and there's a supernatural, but we were given a seichel. Let's use it to understand the world and to appreciate it. And I thank you for coming today. And everyone have a wonderful day. Refuah Shalema to Liz.